work that I did with the organization No More Deaths there in Arizona, and also work that I've been doing more recently in St. Paul as part of the Detainee Assistance Project through Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota. And what I really want to talk about today is the idea of a movement against deportations and detention of immigrants in the United States. But I think that before I talk about this idea of building a movement or this idea of how we could have this movement look, what is really important is to talk about why we might need a movement against deportation and against detention. And really this boils down to a key phrase or a key idea that I'm going to introduce in a second. And I really am going to have to ask you to bear with me on this because this is a sort of a new idea probably for a lot of people. And it's also a pretty controversial one. And so I'm not going to ask you to instantly agree with everything I say, but I am going to ask you to seriously consider and take seriously the possibilities of what I'm about to talk about. And that idea is the idea of global apartheid, specifically talking about our current border security policies that we see in the United States, but also in Europe and with the wall construction that's going on in Israel, between Israel and Palestine. And this is a concept that's been developed by academics in the past few years who are all working on migration issues and specifically on the issues of constraints to migration and immigration and border control work. And the point of the use of the term global apartheid to talk about immigration control is to really draw parallels between current immigration control policies in the US and otherwise and elsewhere all across the world, and previous apartheid systems like apartheid in South Africa, the obvious example, but also segregation in the US and other systems that are designed to divide populations based on specific criteria. And really the core idea of this concept is that there are policies that are based on the idea that we can divide groups of people based on conditions of their birth, that is, conditions that they can't choose and conditions that they can't really change. So in the case of apartheid in South Africa and in the case of segregation in the US, these conditions were racial categories. So if you're born black, you're born into a very different country than if you were born white. What we see with global apartheid is that these are actually national categories. And if you're born Mexican, or if you're born Somali, or if you're born anywhere outside the United States, you're actually born into a really different situation than if you're born in the United States. And the point of the idea is to challenge national categories and challenge the relevance of nationality as a really legitimate way of dividing people. So most of us in this room, I think, will probably agree that apartheid policies and segregation are really self-evidently evil. I don't think that there's probably anybody in this room who would agree that we really need to go back to segregation. It's less obvious for us that border policy right now is similar in any way. But I think that there really are some fundamental similarities that are based on what I talked about earlier about the idea that we can divide people based on these conditions of their birth, nationality, race, etc. And to anyone who's looked at the US-Mexico border and looked at the wealth gap, we can see that there's definitely a wealth gap across international borders that really constitutes a policy of separate and unequal. So that's actually a rather broad way of talking about immigration issues and a really theoretical one. And there are actually a lot of really specific stories that that really illustrate how this injustice is carried out on a personal level. And these are things that I've run into, both talking to people who are subject to entirely different legal regimes. For example, I recently spoke to a man who's a green card holder in the United States. He's a legal permanent resident. He's been in the United States for 30 years, but he's facing deportation over a minor drug charge that happened in 2005. And for me, that minor drug charge would not be a huge mark against me. It would be a misdemeanor. But for him, it's quite possibly going to force him to move back to Mexico, which is a country that he hardly knows and hasn't visited in the past 30 years. So I think we can see that that really is evidence of a totally different legal system. There's also there are also innumerable people who I've talked to who are facing deportation and who will never get a fair trial simply because they do not have access to any kind of legitimate legal assistance. There are no public defenders in federal immigration court, and if you can't pay for a lawyer, you have to defend yourself. And the reason we have public defenders in this country is so that everyone can get a fair trial under the law. That's not true if you're not a citizen. The stories of people who have been deported, I think, are even more heartbreaking. I talked to someone in Nogales, Mexico, who was recently deported and whose family has lived in St. Paul, just a few blocks from where I go to school, for more than 10 years. Really, he has more roots in the Twin Cities than I do. However, he was deported to Mexico, and really the city he was deported to, Nogales, Mexico, was just as alien and foreign to him as it was to me. However, because I'm a citizen and he wasn't, at the end of the day, when I talked to him, I crossed the border and showed my passport, and he slept on the street and tried to make plans to illegally cross the border to rejoin his wife and kids so that he could make the money that they need for their medical bills. So what I really want to talk about today is what we can do in solidarity with people who have suffered or been victimized by these border policies. I believe that apartheid must be ended by those people who are oppressed by it, but I also believe that solidarity movements have been really important in ending apartheid policies everywhere. And we can see this in the Freedom Riders in the period of segregation in the U.S., and we can also see this in the international boycott that happened against South Africa during the South African apartheid rule. So I want to know what a solidarity movement might look like in the United States. And we can already see some manifestations of this kind of movement in the work that's being done for immigration reform. However, this rarely addresses the root issues of migration, and more often what we see in terms of immigration reform policies is the idea that we will have legalization for the people who are here right now in exchange for more draconian policies against people who might cross in the future. We might get a little closer to looking at this kind of solidarity movement through work taking place on the U.S.-Mexico border that documents abuse by the Border Patrol and actually works in direct solidarity with people who are coming across and facing the possibility of death crossing in the desert in southern Arizona, where migrant aid groups put out thousands and thousands of gallons of water in order to attempt to lower the death toll on the border. But I think that we don't have to stop there. And I think that anti-racist and anti-deportation work really has to take place throughout the United States and can really take place here in Minnesota. There are thousands of deportations that are happening here annually, and there are really important actions that we could take in solidarity. Some of these things are already happening, like in St. Paul, there's a group that recently is starting to visit detention centers where people who are in deportation proceedings are held. There's the work that certain labor groups are doing right now, and Centro de Trabajadores Unidos en Lucha is here at the conference, and I think they presented yesterday, and hopefully some of you got a chance to see their presentation. There are also legal aid there's still room for much more. For example, after having had that conversation with the man deported from St. Paul, what if I had gotten together with a group of friends or a group of allies and decided to work in solidarity with his family and try and help them through the really difficult period of having the main breadwinner of their family deported? Another example is happening in Arizona, where communities are mobilizing around individuals who are in deportation proceedings. Usually people who have been in the country for a really long time and been really active in the community. And in Arizona, they've actually been able to mobilize enough support to get immigration and customs enforcement to cancel or indefinitely postpone the deportations of several individuals. I know that we have that capacity to build those communities and build that pressure here in Minnesota. And so, what if we were to do that? One of the most uplifting calls I've ever received as part of the detention project was not from someone who wanted to know their legal rights or wanted to know if they could get a lawyer. It was from a woman who actually wanted to know if there was access to the court proceedings so that she could bring family and friends and community members to her brother's deportation hearing to show support and to show that he was a valued member of the community. What if there was a group or a movement in Minnesota that did exactly that? I'm leaving this panel open-ended for a reason, I think, which is that I really believe that we have a movement to build in Minnesota, and it's not my job or the job of any one person to determine what that movement will eventually look like. In the end, what I hope to have done through this short talk is to show that this kind of struggle is possible and to broaden the ideas of what immigrant rights organizing or immigrant rights can even mean. A few decades ago, segregation was natural. Within my lifetime, apartheid was a legitimate policy in South Africa. Now that these policies have been torn down, we can see that they were always self-evidently evil. The borders that divide us today, from the U.S. Southwest to apartheid walls in Israel,